Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. We need addiction. This is what very few people talk about. But if people who do deep somatic work, trauma, emotional repression work, that actually link up the unconscious to what's arising, see the connection, then you see that the cravings and the compulsions are coming straight from buried emotions. These are emotions we can't feel. It's just a contraction in our bodies. And from that, we get this craving or urge or compulsion that's screaming for relief from what? From emotions that we've buried a long time ago. Our main habit is the habit of suffering. Prior to any addiction, we learn how to suffer by holding back what's true, burying emotions, and then identifying with what's false. And when anybody lives like that, addiction is one of the solutions. It's not, it might become part of the problem, but many of us grew into addiction because it was how we survived. Whether it started with sugar when we were kids or something else, it graduated or became substance abuse, drugs, alcohol, sex, porn addiction, the classic addictions, or food issues. These are ways that we've survived with buried emotions, though. We've needed these things. To stigmatize addiction is to stigmatize the thing that we've needed. What people don't talk about are the needs. That the addictions come from buried emotions which have with them the need to stay safe and get love. So these are deep needs that can be processed such that we can free ourselves from that enslavement, but we can't ignore them because they're driving us. So when we use something and we're stuffing down hurt or sadness that's totally buried, we're keeping it down, or anger, we need that in that moment. We don't have the capacity or the skill or whatever it takes in that moment to be with whatever it is, so the addiction comes in to keep us from having to feel that. And we don't even know that we're doing it for that reason. The system, there's a reward, and that reward is what we go back to. There's a reason for the reward. If you look at the science, emotional repression drives addiction, and the reward system is connected to not only all the stuff that they say it's connected to, the brain, the chemicals, the dopamine, whatever, but we have repressed emotions because the same body that experiences alcohol free of repression is not the same body that experiences it with repression. The trauma is a key factor in all this. What we hold in our bodies, even if we have a genetic predisposition or there's some environmental or other factor outside of emotions, there's plenty, there are tons actually of science telling us that buried emotions drive this. There's a lot of science about the brain and the reward system and all that. But what do you do with that? I mean, unless they develop a drug or something that does something at that level where we have the capacity to change and transform as with the body, where we've held emotion back and where the actual desire, craving, compulsion is coming from. But we need addiction until we are ready to get to the buried emotions. And often what people do is they'll go from one addiction to the other. And because they can't resolve the whole pattern because they still have the buried emotions. When we try to put a behavior to rest, or even especially all behaviors, before we get to the driver, it generally doesn't work. And so we end up going somewhere else to some other addiction. This is just a fact of life for people who have this pattern with their repression. And I say the mature way to deal with that is to deal with the problem and not the solution. You, from an early age or whenever age, that alcohol, that addiction, whatever it is, served an important function for you to keep you safe, help you survive. Your system became conditioned to go back there because you have those same buried emotions protecting you even today. and then driving you back to the addiction today. You need that until you don't anymore. That's true compassion. And authentic recovery is when we align ourselves with reality, which is the reality we have buried emotions. And they demand compulsion because they're buried emotions, because we're trying to stuff down and keep down what we've buried. Simple logic. Until you deal with the buried emotions, you're going to have some sort of compulsion if that's your pattern. So this is really about self-compassion. This is the first time I've talked about the subject of addiction in probably over 5 years, except for maybe here and there, because I don't want to bring to the table just another voice that says, okay, well, unconditional love is the answer, or it's the genes, or it's trauma. But where's the pathway for transformation? We have that here now with the repression inquiry. So I feel comfortable talking about it, but it exists. This set of tools, this pathway, is situated in a different context, maybe than you've ever been involved with when it comes to recovery from addiction, because we just focus on getting to the buried emotions. We don't focus on behavior. We don't sit there and go, oh shit, I'm drinking again, or I want this, or I can't have that. We use those things to get to the buried emotions that drive, one, the suffering, and two, they actually drive our attempts to alleviate the suffering. The buried emotions create the suffering, and then they lead us to addictions to try to soothe those same buried emotions. You can't get out of that unless there's a different way of looking at it. Think about this for a second. It's a double bind. In all of us who have addiction, we have on one side of the double bind, I need that. Because deep in the body we've buried emotions. We need love and safety is what we need. And we need safety from those buried emotions. So then we need this substance or this activity on one side of the coin. But then we need to stop using it, or do it less, or feel ashamed about it. There's the other side of the coin. So we need it, but we shouldn't have it. Feel that? I have to have it, but I can't. That's a double bind that you can't get out of through the mind, through any recovery that's based in the mind. You can't get out of that through just mindfulness or meditation or awareness based, because that double bind comes from emotional repression in the body. Just as the science says, our compulsions come because we're soothing those buried emotions. There's the one side of the coin. And then the shame, what we discovered here, is the shame for these buried emotions and the shame for our behavior. Because if, for example, if you bury anger, you have to be a good girl at the surface and stop your addictions, or be a good boy, or get somebody's love and approval somewhere, mom and dad, or even mom and dad living in your own body and you don't even know that you're driven to stop your addictions for the same reason that you're addicted. Emotional repression drives you to the thing. Emotional repression tries to get you to stop doing the thing for the same needs: love, safety, approval. You can't get out of that until you make the unconscious conscious, until you go to where the buried emotions are, to where the conditioning that produces those, you could say two things, that dualism between I have to have it, but I shouldn't, and I need to stop. And you discover in that, if you process at the repression level, your authenticity, which is the answer, the medicine, if you will, for the enslavement of addiction and the shame around it. Because if you have a recovery that's based in shame, is that really authentic to not be using or to do something because you're ashamed of it? See, that comes from repression. So what does an authentic recovery look like? If we need addiction because we've buried emotions, authentic recovery would be processing the buried emotions and having a lot of self-compassion for how that continues to create suffering and addiction until we clear the buried emotions. And there's this process of patience, really. And this is why I started with this podcast, to prime the pump, if you will, for this subject, because this is a subject that Dan and I started with. Addiction, if you guys know the history of this work, we started in a hot tub. Every night together we lived, me and my husband, and Dan came to live with us. It was me and Dan in the hot tub developing the first versions of KI. And it was with Dan's porn addiction that we did it with. And we discovered so much through that. But when we discovered how well it works with addiction, I think both of us knew that we didn't want to limit it to that topic, because we felt it was so much bigger. I mean, my chronic pain, my nerve pain left. So many other things were happening for both of us. Like, life was just opening up. Transformation was happening. We didn't want to go into this narrow addiction box. And I'm so glad we didn't, because I have seen since then that shame keeps us from really dealing with issues. And if we can feel ashamed about an addiction, it can keep us really not dealing with relational issues. And so I'm so glad that what Dan and I did is approached it completely differently, not in any way a shame-based approach, but a more realistic, science-based, experiential approach that gets to the root of it. Like, it's those are big words to say. If you're going to get to the root of your addiction here, but you have to get it out of that black and white thinking. See, the double bind. The black and white thinking is the dualistic thinking, like either using or not using, because you have that's energy in your body. I have to use versus I shouldn't or I can't, the shame. So when you're just dealing at that level of I have to but I shouldn't, you can't put that beast to rest that way. You really do have to see all that comes from that one place, that all of that suffering comes from the one place, which is where you hold the fear of being yourself in the body. And then let it unfold. The black and white thinking of I'm done, or that I need to be done, will go away, because you'll see that that's often driven by shame or the need to be good or be seen a certain way. And when you step into your authenticity, you're going to own your life. You're not going to live it for other people. And that's what addiction often is holding our emotions back and living for others anyway. So recovery should look like authenticity. And what's authentic for you and how you live your life is your business. And a big part of repression is feeling ashamed about what you do. So whatever your recovery looks like, own that. You're allowed to here. The only quality or let me say requirement to do recovery with us is just earnestness. So in other words, of course people still have addictions when they come here, because their unconscious repression is holding on to that for dear life. And until they clear those buried emotions, why wouldn't they be addicted? Is a better question. And so then there's a lot of patience, a lot of compassion, and a lot of space for people to transform in their lives and in their relationship. And even they will continue to need some addiction, some people will, until they get to that place where they can really stand in their own experience. And even then they might have a glass of wine or something every now and then, because there aren't any rules in being yourself. The rules come from not being yourself. And that's not recovery. That's just more suffering. To be interested in ending addiction, but at the same time not being interested in discovering yourself, that's what addiction was always about, if you look. It was always about we were looking for ourselves. And we weren't looking for sobriety only, or we weren't looking for just a spiritual awakening. We were looking for what we never could have when we were kids. What started the addiction path from the beginning. We didn't have ourselves. We didn't have these buried emotions, and we've always felt like there was something lacking, something missing, because it was. We weren't wrong about that. People told us otherwise, But we trusted our experience and we kept using because we felt like something was missing, because it was. And until somebody comes up with a better damn solution, people will continue using. As Dan once said, the offer of freedom has got to be better than the offer of addiction, or it won't happen. And finally, we developed work that offers something better than addiction. But until you clear the buried emotions, you'll need some addictions. Even if you give up alcohol, we support you in everything that you do that is earnest for you and authentic for you. If you give up alcohol, you might still have porn addiction, though. Even if you give up porn addiction, you might still have the addiction to suffering. I mean, even if you give up everything that you use to soothe your suffering, you still have suffering. Isn't that what addiction is soothing suffering? So what Dan and I have always said is, I suffer. What we do is we try to find a way to soothe the suffering, but the point of KI is, well, but why suffer when you can get to the root of it now? We'll continue suffering as long as it's safer to suffer than it is to feel and express what's true. And when it's safe, or we feel open enough or whole enough to be our authentic self, to feel and express what's true, we will not rely on things in the same way. We need those things until we don't. I can't think of a better and more compassionate way of recovery. If compassion is important, could it be any more than that, than to recognize that we've always needed that, and we're going to continue needing it until we don't anymore? That feels better to me than anyone trying to force me to do something, or me trying to be something that I'm not. My recovery has been as much about the recovery from being a good boy as it's anything else. And my focus on hiding my pleasures, first of all, and then trying to get rid of those pleasures that I was hiding to get love and approval from other people is over. It was just anger repression. We hide the bad parts. When we bury emotions, we have to hide the parts that do not go along with the falseness that we show to other people. We have to hide. We don't have a choice. We can't show those parts until we can, and that just means standing in your authenticity and saying sometimes fuck off, or I'm hurt by that, shut up, leave me alone, here's a boundary, goodbye. And then we go on living. So many of us have been powerless, and we've been letting other people decide how we live. Let your recovery, your life be yours. Then you'll be free. But be earnest. This is the thing I'll leave you with. If you're not earnest, what happens is you'll pick up practices and teachings like this and use it to stay safe and get love and not get to the buried emotions. And this work is all about getting to the buried emotions. It's not about having a new paradigm that makes people feel good. About behavior that they've always felt bad about. It's about the real work, but along the way, if you don't feel safe to share whatever you've hidden, how could it even be a recovery path? Really? And so hopefully, if nothing else, this podcast lets every one of you feel like, no matter what your addiction is, and I've heard it all, I think I've heard it all, come talk to me, because, well, only the earnest among you that really wants to work with me one-on-one, but just come and tell me if your subject is addiction. And this is something that people don't like to talk about, but yet it's the pathway to freedom. It's one of them. So I have a 90-day program in which I'm just working with people, in some cases, not all cases, on one issue or a couple. And by focusing on that one issue, they're going to get to have the freedom that I had because I focused on one issue, chronic pain. Dan focused on really one in the beginning, addiction. Narrow is the way, as they say. surprisingly. Come talk to me. I've got a link in the description there for you. And if you're not ready for that, you can go to repressiontest.com and take our repression test. That automatically adds you to the newsletter. Please subscribe, like, follow, and share. Thank you.